And thank you for your interest in how hierarchical syntactic structure predicts listener sequence completion in music. My name is Steffen Herff, and I'm part of a digital and cognitive musicology lab here at EPFL in Lausanne. This research was funded by the ESC. So what do I mean by hierarchical structures? So the most apparent example comes from the domain of language. So let's consider the sentence: I borrowed the big book of poems with the red cover. One way to think about the sentence is that this sentence was generated using a particular grammar, in this case the grammar of English, and by applying rules recursively we generated this grammatical sentence. So for example, this is what it might look like. We have a start symbol and we split the start symbol using one of our rules into a noun phrase and a verb phrase. And then we keep going, we use our verb phrase and we split it into a verb and a noun phrase. And by doing this step by step, we end up not only with our surface, which is a grammatical sentence of English because we use the English grammar, but we also end up having this really nice tree structure, and this can be very useful because it tells us about dependencies between the objects of our sentence. And in this particular example, what it tells us is that with the red cover relates to book rather than poem. We call this a long-term dependency because there's no adjacency relationship between them. This is important because these no long-term dependency is a hallmark of hierarchical structures. Now, the concept of hierarchical structures is not limited to language. Indeed, it has been proposed for a whole lot of different domains such as dance, narrative, action planning, music, and many, many more. Usually, it is proposed that we can use these hierarchical structures to analyze or describe structures or objects within these domains, but sometimes it's also proposed that these analyses then, or of the structure, which then reveal dependencies, may have perceptual relevance. What we mean by perceptual relevance is that when we have this dependency relationship, then it should predict or inform perception of human beings. Now, in this particular example, as you probably guessed from the title, we're particularly interested in the case of music. So the question is, how does such a hierarchical structure may look like in music? Here's one way of how it could be like. It's very similar to the example I did present in the case of language. And here we have a start symbol S and we split it. We apply a rule and produce our tonal center, in this case a C minor chord. Now, through recursive application of rules, we can generate our musical surface, much like we've done it in the linguistic example in the very beginning. So for example, here we can apply a prolongation rule. And what this does is we take our C minor chords and we split it into two C minor chords. We may or may not change the voicing in one of them, but the heart of it is that we are simply prolonging our first symbol. But of course there are also other rules. So for example, I could splice in here a nice preparation rule. And what a preparation rule does is that it prepares another chord. In this particular case, we're introducing a C minor and we split it into something that prepares the C minor, in this case a dominant, and thereby generating an expectation towards this chord. And now, much like in the linguistic examples, we apply rule after rule to further elaborate it and produce our musical surface. For example, we could apply a prolongation rule to our dominant as well. And nothing is stopping us from embedding a nice preparation rule here to prepare the second one of instances of our prepared dominant. Now, similar to the linguistic example, this not only allows us to produce grammatically accurate musical surfaces which are specific to the rule set, and the rule set being specific to a particular musical idiom, but it also allows us to report or analyze dependencies. And specifically in this case, we can see that this dominant here prepares this C minor chord rather than the adjacent chord here. And what you can see here is that this is a nice long-term dependency, so it's a hierarchical structure. Now, the question remains, this is nice out of a theoretical perspective, but is there actual perceptual relevance to these structures? Now, testing perceptual relevance in a non-linguistic domain is far from trivial, and the reasons for these are twofold, at least. The first one is a question of expertise. Now, in terms of language, we know that most people are fluent in at least one language, And language has a high cultural as well as evolutionary pressure. So it's being used on a day-to-day basis. There's a lot of practice, and we can assume that the general expertise in utilizing a language is relatively high in our population. However, that's not necessarily the case in music. Yes, music or dance is culturally very relevant, but the amount of exposure and usage, unless you are professional, is comparably little if you compare it to something like language. And the other case is the question of semantics. So in language, when we're interested in the predictions of the grammar, we can use semantics as a shortcut, and we don't really have that opportunity in music. So for example, let's consider the sentence, "The dog chasing the cat is grey." I could easily ask you, or my participant, who is grey? And then I can maybe investigate two hypothetical grammars, one of which says, I predict that the cat is grey, and my other hypothetical grammar says, well, I think the listeners or participants think that the dog is grey. And it turns out that if we ask enough participants, most of them don't think that the cat is grey, most of them do think that the dog is grey, and we now see which of those grammar has more predictive power or perceptual relevance. But we don't really have this luxury in case of music, so we have to come up with a new approach. And what we're using here as a new approach is a really nice feature of syntactic structure, and this is that structure for its navigation or expectations. So for example, if I use a sentence such as, I like pizza, and I ask you how many more words are needed before the sentence is complete, then you will probably say, actually I'm quite happy with how the sentence is, and of course you would be right. But let's say I use a different example and I go, I like, and then ask you how many more words are needed before the sentence is complete, then chances are good that you will accurately say, well, I feel a bit dissatisfied, there's an expectation open, I think one more word is required. And indeed you would be right, here in this case an object such as pizza. But we can push it even further. For example, I could go, I like and then ask you how many more words are needed before the sentence is complete. And you might rightfully identify that you can't finish it without a word, you can't finish it with one more word, you need at least two, in this case a verb and an object. For example, I like and devour pizza. Now how can we use this? So again, we can use our hypothetical grammars, here hypothetical grammar A and B, both of which can make predictions. And as we can see here, after asking our participants, the predictions of grammar A are pretty rubbish, but grammar B makes very accurate predictions. So what we now know is that grammar B predicts participant behavior much, much better. So it seems that whatever information is contained in grammar B is information that's available to the participant. That does not necessarily mean that participants or listeners operate precisely under this grammar, but it means that they have a representation that contains the same information that is represented in this grammar as well. And this is precisely what we used in our musical domain. So specifically what we did is we generated 32 stimuli based on the jazz idiom. We then merged them with a pendulum, and the pendulum served two functions. The first one was to strongly establish a sense of key or tonality, and the second one was to blur metrical information, which otherwise might have influenced the experimental design. Then after generating these stimuli, we went to the end of them and either cut the no chord, the first chord, 2 or 3, starting from the end. And then we used these complete or incomplete stimuli and presented them to 150 participants and asked them, hey, how many more chords to come before this musical phrase is complete? And then we used these perceptual responses and compared them with the predictions of two grammar models, one of which was a hierarchical model and the other one being a more local bigram model. These models were created and implemented by Daniel here, and I will just quickly summarize what he did. The hierarchical model is an instance of a probabilistic context-free grammar, a standard model to describe hierarchical structures in sequential data. Such grammar models can be used to analyze the structure of a sequence of words or chord symbols by recreating it through recursive elaboration of shorter sequences, much like we've done with both the musical as well as the linguistic examples earlier. More precisely, probabilistic context-free grammars assign each tree analysis a probability that can be interpreted as the plausibility of that tree. The probability of a sequence is then defined as the sum of the probabilities of all the tree analyses. Now, the parameters of the grammar used here were inferred from a dataset of tree analyses of 150 jazz tunes that were annotated by musical expert. We predicted the completion length lambda of the stimulus sigma using the probability of lambda conditioned on sigma, where the joint probability of any completion length and stimulus is given by marginalizing over all completion sequences of length lambda. Now this is the hierarchical model. We then compare this with the bigram model. So in other words, the question is, we want to test whether local information is already enough to predict the completion length. And for this we compare the hierarchical model with our bigram model. Bigram here is just another word for a pair of two chords that represents a chord transition. So the model could also be called local chord transition model. Since the bigram model does not consider tree analyses, its parameters were inferred directly from the sequences analyzed in the just tuned dataset. The length predictions of the bigram model are calculated very similarly to the hierarchical model. The only difference is the calculation of the sequence probabilities. So while the probability of a sequence is computed with respect to the tree analyses under the hierarchical model, a sequence probability in the bigram model is simply the product of its chord transition probabilities. Now, so we use these models and we train them on the expert annotations. And then we use this fit-in model to predict expert annotations of pieces that they previously haven't seen. And what we see is that indeed the hierarchical model is much, much better than our random baseline in predicting unseen structural annotations of experts. Whereas the bigram model is not. This on its own is not particularly surprising. Indeed, the whole motivation of this research was that we saw in expert annotations that there are long-term dependencies, so hierarchical structures. So this can really only be taken as a sanity test that our premise is accurate. However, only because a hierarchical model captures this hierarchical information that expert annotators represent does not necessarily mean that this information is also relevant for perception. Indeed, we know that bigram models often do a very good job in predicting dissonance perception. So to answer the question if the hierarchical model carries incremental predictive power over the bigram model in a perceptual sense, we need to look at the perceptual data. And indeed, here's what we found. Specifically, what we observe is that both the hierarchical as well as the bigram model outperform the baseline. So this on its own is already quite exciting, but furthermore relevant to our precise research question is the fact that the hierarchical model slightly outperforms the bigram model, and the fact that the most competitive model we found uses the information of the hierarchical model, or the prediction of the hierarchical grammar model, as well as a hierarchical cross-bigram interaction term. So what does this mean? Well, first of all, we provide evidence supporting prior claims that hierarchical models better represent music theoretical notions of structure in music. As mentioned before, this is not particularly surprising. Indeed, it was part of the motivation of the study that much literature already report that there are hierarchical structures in music, and indeed that many analysts already use techniques that symbolize hierarchical structures in music. But it shows that indeed all these assumptions are accurate. There are hierarchical structures in expert annotations of music. Now, what we also see is that both the predictions of a bigram as well as a hierarchical model trained on expert annotations carry predictive value for participant closure perception in music. Now, this is quite exciting because what this means is that our expert annotators have insight into the structures of music, and these structural insights translate into the perception. So the annotations of the expert directly allow or carry predictive value for the perception of listeners, and in our case, non-expert listeners. Now, what we also see is that the hierarchical model carries incremental predictive power over the bigram model. So this answers our original research question. Indeed, A, expert annotation do carry hierarchical information, and B, this hierarchical information does contain information that is of perceptual relevance, which cannot be explained by a bigram model. However, the bigram model also further improves predictions when added as an interaction term. Now, this is quite interesting because it means that it is in the current state, the perception of listeners is not best explained by either a bigram model or a hierarchical model, but rather by a hierarchical model plus an interaction between the hierarchical and the bigram model, which means that both the hierarchical and the bigram model have access to information that the other one does not capture just as well. And what this means for future research is that future studies could investigate how the local and the hierarchical representation may interact to form perceptual judgment, and whether and how this may be mediated by musical expertise. And as always, all data, stimuli, and code are available here, and I thank you very much for your interest in our research.